Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Christina Ewig. I'm a professor of public affairs at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where I also direct the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. We are pleased to have you with us today for a presentation of a new report by the National Academies called Women's Empowerment, Population Dynamics, and Socioeconomic Development. The Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy was founded in 1985, the first of its kind in a school of public affairs. We are dedicated to illuminating gender-based disparities and their interactions with other forms of inequality through research, teaching, and public engagement. Before we launch into the presentation today of the report findings and discussion of the report with our distinguished guests, I want to begin by acknowledging that in Minnesota, we live, learn, and work each day on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous peoples. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on Dakota land, ceded under duress in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. This university would not be here today if not for the vast land resources taken during European settlement. The Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy continually seeks to counter these past and present injustices through mutually beneficial partnerships and practices that respect indigeneity and which highlight the interrelationships between different forms of inequality. Today's event focuses on inequalities faced by women around the world and how these gender inequalities are interrelated with population dynamics and socioeconomic development. The study of these interrelationships dates back decades, and the National Academies report that you will hear about today seeks to summarize that knowledge and also point us into new directions for better understanding these interrelationships. Now, you might be asking, what exactly is a National Academies report? The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine are private nonprofit institutions. The National Academy of Sciences was created by an act of Congress in 1863 to advise the nation on issues related to science and technology. The National Academies of Engineering and the academies as a whole regularly convene top independent experts in their fields to contribute research reports on issues of national or global significance. The reports are developed through a process of deliberation among selected experts and then go through a rigorous process of review. And I am very delighted to have with us today two esteemed committee members that authored the National Academy's most recent report, Women's Empowerment, Population Dynamics, and Socioeconomic Development. These are Dr. Ragui Assaad and Dr. Kathryn Yount. I'm going to introduce them briefly. Dr. Assaad is the Freeman Chair in International Economic Policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. His research focuses on labor markets and human development in the Arab world with a focus on youth and gender issues. Professor Assaad is a research fellow of the Economic Research Forum in Cairo, Egypt, and at the Institute for the Study of Labor in Bonn, Germany. He has served as Regional Director for West Asia and North Africa for the Population Council based in Cairo, Egypt from 2005 to 2008, and as a consultant for the World Bank, the International Labor Organization, the Ford Foundation, UNICEF, and UNDP. Dr. Kathryn Yount is Asa Riggs Candler Chair of Global Health and Professor of Global Health and Sociology at Emory University. Her research centers on the social determinants of women's health, including mixed methods evaluations of social norms and empowerment-based programs to reduce gender-based violence and health disparities in underserved populations. She has more than 250 publications in the social sciences and global health. Dr. Yount is an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the section on social, economic, and political sciences. Notes before we come into our presentation. The format of the event is we will begin with a presentation of the report by Drs. Yount and Dr. Assaad. This will be followed by a moderated question and answer period. The chat function is disabled, but there is a Q&A function available to you. So as questions occur to you, please put them into the Q&A. I will be sorting through the questions posed in the Q&A and mix them with my own questions in the moderated discussion portion. We do have live transcription enabled through Zoom for this event. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Assaad and Dr. Yount. Thank you.
Dr. Arweed, thank you so much for the opportunity to present findings from the consensus report on women's empowerment, population dynamics, and socioeconomic development. It's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Ragui Assaad, and without further ado, to allow time for discussion, we'll go ahead and begin with the presentation of the report and recommendations. Next slide, please. Dr. Emory talked a little bit about the National Academies, its history and background, and I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the committee members who contributed to the report, co-chairs Dr. Anita Raj and Dr. Susan Scrimshaw, respectively from Tulane University, and retired from the Russell Sage College, Dr. Ragui Assaad, who's here with us today, Sonalda Desai from the University of Maryland, Alethea Donald, Pascaline Dupas, Kelly Hall, Poonam Mutreja, Luca Pasando, Galeen Sumari, Tom Vogel, Johannes Wado, and myself. It's important to underscore the emphasis that the National Academies places on interdisciplinarity. We have disciplines related to psychology, sociology, demography, economics, development studies, and public health represented in the committee, and gave attention to the importance of both geographic and identity diversity on the committee, where we felt we may benefit from additional representation of ideas or other identities. We invited people to give presentations during our deliberations, and there are appendices in the report that supplement the primary content. So thanks to all of those. And our effort today will be to provide consensus findings and recommendations from the committee as a whole. Next slide. The statement of task is important, and I'll take a moment just to acknowledge the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who at the time supported this project. The statement of task focused our charge and identified its boundaries, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. This is an ad hoc committee of the National Academies and was charged to undertake a study that would review and assess what is known about the impact of women's empowerment with associated population dynamics and global social and economic development. We were charged with developing a comprehensive conceptual framework and iterated with that framework to review the current state of knowledge, to critically assess the policy implications of synthesized knowledge, and to set an agenda primarily for future research and data collection to inform the scientific community. And the study may provide recommendations in each of these related areas. So that was the charge of the committee. And I'd like to share on the next slides some of the working definitions that we can perhaps discuss later in our presentation. The committee spent a great deal of time developing working definitions, iterating with the existing literature, developing a comprehensive understanding of existing frameworks. And so I wanted to go through a few of the definitions that evolved from a consensus discussion on these concepts. First, empowerment is the expansion and safeguarding an important addition of an individual or group's ability to make strategic life choices and to act on those choices to reach self-determined or collective goals. I'll just emphasize the committee underscores the importance of recognizing empowerment at both individual and group levels, and determination, both conceptualized as self-determination and collective determination of shared goals and interests. So a multi-level concept of empowerment is emphasized throughout the report. Women's empowerment is the application of empowerment as defined above to women and girls specifically, recognizing that women's empowerment may occur in a complex context that includes restrictive social and gender norms and potentially gender biases in both the formal structures and informal institutions or norms that may disadvantage cisgender heterosexual women, as well as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and or questioning intersex or other individuals relative to cisgender heterosexual men. Women's empowerment may be expressed or experienced differently. The committee spent a lot of time talking about the concept of intersectionality related to specific identities, such as based on race, ethnicity, caste, class, or religion. This definition of empowerment builds on previous definitions, but I did want to underscore the importance emphasized in the consensus definition on questions of intersectionality. So empowerment is not experienced in the same way among women, but may be differentially experienced based on these various dimensions of identification and also marginalization. Agency is an individual or collective's ability to act upon personal or shared aspirations toward the realization of self-determined or collectively determined goals. You see again the committee's emphasis on multi-level concepts of agency. Agency is a component of empowerment that connects enabling resources and aspirations to achievement. This is grounded in Kabir's work from the 1990s, which we identified in a number of frameworks that we reviewed. It operates at multiple levels, and we'll talk a little bit more about the individual, interpersonal, community, and societal levels at which agency is conceptualized to operate and the empirical literature is identified in the report. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, we also have working definitions in the report on population dynamics and socioeconomic development. Both of these are multidimensional concepts, the former including growth composition and distribution of the population, the contributing roles of fertility, mortality, and migration, either globally or in given specific geographic areas. Analyses of population dynamics typically are quantitative, although not always, and consider factors that affect fertility, mortality, and migration from the individual to the population level. So again, our definition of population dynamics emphasizes a multi-level concept. Socioeconomic development is the process and achievement of social and economic advancement, again, at multiple levels. And this process includes improvements in standards of living, education, health, civil engagement, and state capacity. Next slide. A subgroup of the committee spent quite a bit of time reviewing existing frameworks to understand existing conceptualizations, concepts related to women's empowerment. We identified some important consistencies across those frameworks. For example, many of the frameworks identified common concepts related to resources or enabling resources, agency, and the importance of an enabling socio-contextual, socio-cultural normative environment. However, we identified in that review several limitations of existing frameworks which informed the consensus framework that I'll show in just a minute. First, measures and concepts of empowerment vary quite a bit across frameworks and literature. Definitions of those concepts also tend not to be consistent. There are many frameworks that are sector-specific and focus on sector-specific outcomes, for example, such as fertility, There are frameworks in WASH. There are frameworks in the agricultural sector. Several frameworks lacked clear definition of multi-level ecological considerations with respect to women's empowerment. And so you can see the emphasis in previous definitions, recognizing that agency is a multi-level concept, resources that can be invested is identified as a multi-level concept, population dynamics, socioeconomic development, each can operate at multiple levels. Previous frameworks did not have a consistent or explicit discussion of the role of enabling resources. Some previous frameworks identified resources as an input. Other frameworks identified resources as a component or aspect of the empowerment process. And so there was some inconsistency in that regard as well. Most importantly, for our purposes, previous frameworks did not offer a comprehensive review of the relationship between the concepts of interest to the charge of the committee, specifically the interrelationships between women's empowerment and population dynamics and socioeconomic development. So this review of past frameworks was informative to understand areas of agreement, areas of disagreement or inconsistency, and gaps in those frameworks. And so the next slide presents the comprehensive conceptual framework that's the consensus committee developed. This framework was developed over a fairly substantial period of time, interacting with the theoretical and conceptual literature, but also evolved as we continued to review the empirical literature as well. The committee's review highlighted the central role of women's agency, which you see in green in the center of the framework. Here you can see depicted the multi-level dimensions of women's agency, and I'll just underscore individual or intrapersonal dimension of agency, the interpersonal dimension of agency, the community dimension, and societal dimension. The framework shows how resources shown on the far left and defined as levers for change, where these may be potential opportunities for investments in the future, can support empowerment and illustrates the role of population dynamics as a potential mechanism through which empowerment can operate to influence socioeconomic development. The framework acknowledges that these relationships are often bidirectional or otherwise interrelated, and just wanted to recognize that the charge of the committee was to identify the ways in which women's empowerment, conceptualized here as levers for change at the societal, community, and individual interpersonal level, relates to women's agency and how those factors may influence socioeconomic development and population dynamics. So the findings of the report tend to emphasize that directionality of the relationship, but the conceptual framework recognizes the potential bidirectionality and some evidence for the directions, not a primary charge to the committee, but nonetheless are acknowledged in the empirical chapters. The framework also recognizes importantly, and this was identified as a source of variability or a gap in other frameworks, is the importance of the sociocultural environment, including norms, institutions, and other structural conditions, particularly barriers related to structural sexism and other structural forms of marginalization, as a critical moderator of women's empowerment processes and its relations with other constructs in the model. So the basic idea is that the process of empowerment is not something that is considered uniformly experienced across contexts, but contexts where there are more restrictive norms may suppress the effects of empowerment or the processes of empowerment relative to contexts that are more enabling. Finally, the rightmost box shows aspirational development goals, which are the higher level goals anticipated when basic human needs are met, human capabilities are realized, and human rights are guaranteed. And those dimensions, I'll just emphasize because the concept of sort of long-term sustainable equitable development was something that the committee discussed in detail. Are dimensions of economic and human security, multidimensional well-being, freedom, dignity, and inclusion, and finally, sustainability. So as I mentioned earlier, the committee utilized this conceptual framework to guide an in-depth review of the literature, examining the role of women's empowerment with relationship to population dynamics and socioeconomic development. Next slide, please. So I want to go briefly into the recommendations. There's much more on this slide that I will discuss in the interest of time. But the report makes recommendations broadly in 3 areas. First, improving measurement. Second, enhancing study designs, which my colleague, Dr. Assaad, will discuss in detail, and collaboration and harmonization, which Dr. Assaad will discuss as well. As we review the literature, improving measurement emerged as a critically important area of focus because committee's review identified inconsistencies in concepts, inconsistencies in measures, as well as limitations and gaps in measurement of the constructs that are included in our comprehensive framework, and that those gaps and inconsistencies remain a primary barrier to advancing knowledge on the role of women's empowerment in population dynamics and socioeconomic development, as well as subsequent targeted interventions that could increase women's empowerment. The committee agreed that data limitations often mean that concepts and relationships considered important in theory often, and this is illustrated in detail in the empirical chapters, often are poorly defined, poorly operationalized, and not comparable across diverse social contexts, which could result in confounding effects. Studies also often lack the full range of data elements, given the complexity of the concepts under consideration in the framework that are necessary to measure women's empowerment and to understand the pathways of influence on population dynamics and socioeconomic development. So recommendation 1 here highlights the range of measures, and there are long lists of them, that are necessary to fully understand elements of women's empowerment. Next slide. Terrific. Okay, recommendation 2 identified the lack of longitudinal data, in particular, limiting understanding of trajectories of change. What I didn't mention previously in the comprehensive framework was that we also recognized that women are embedded in histories and that we're interested in understanding trajectories of empowerment over the life course. So please keep that in mind for the discussion period. Also, a lot of the empirical evidence was based on either cross-sectional data or relatively short-term randomized controlled trials, leaving us wondering, even for policies and programs that demonstrated significant impacts on the concepts of interest, left us wondering about the sustainability of those investments. And so the committee recommends strongly the need for longitudinal studies embedded in designs that are appropriate to estimate causal impacts. And Dr. Assaad will talk about that in more detail. Recommendation 3 on the next slide highlights work needed to develop better measures of women's agency, which again, the committee centralized in its conceptual framework, and areas in which it's important to have a better understanding of the role of agency. And I'll just, in this case, here underscore the bullet points at the bottom. The committee universally recommended emphasis on developing improved measures of individual awareness of rights, aspirations and preferences, goal setting, choice, and internal motivation, which were not outcomes commonly operationalized in the empirical literature. The report also emphasizes the need for better measures of control and decision making, including both economic and reproductive decision making at the individual and interpersonal levels. And importantly, the need for comparable measures of collective agency in formal groups and in informal networks at the community and societal levels, emphasizing the need for measures on shared goals, collective efficacy, collective action towards shared goals. And the final recommendation with respect to measurement is that studies of agency would benefit from a life course perspective. I'm sorry, recommendation 4, next slide. Great. Recognizing that there are trajectories and turning points as people grow and change across life stages. Agency around life transition points and opportunities, such as reproductive or wage earning, can particularly be important to support women to achieve their life goals. So with that, I turn it over to Dr. Assaad, and then hopefully we can open it up for discussions.
Great. Thank you, Kathryn. So could you have next slide, please? I just want to point out also that the geographic purview of the report was low and middle income countries. So the report really focuses on the context of the global South in a major way. So the next recommendation is about the study designs that allow us to really look at causal pathways and be able to say this leads to that. There is a lot of associational studies that basically look at correlation and association between different phenomena. And because of the complexity of how you have reverse causality, you have ability of confounding factors to affect two things at the same time, we felt that we had to give a lot more weight to studies that have a design that really is able to tease out the causal factors. And so these are randomized control trials, quasi-experiments, natural experiments, longitudinal designs, which by their very nature are able to try kind of get these causal pathways. And we think that there should be more emphasis on these kinds of studies. There's also a need to understand the mechanisms much more deeply through qualitative data collection that contextualizes the theories of change and really informs what is happening from a particular intervention or causal pathway to understand the mechanisms. And also these would allow the studies to be informed much more by the perspectives of the women themselves and the communities that are being studied. And also to look at multiple points of intervention in the causal pathway. And then finally, the issue about different points in life course and trajectories is a lot of studies are not giving sufficient attention to different points in the life course. Next slide. The issue also of the sustainability of the effects and whether a lot of the studies, as Kathryn said, are short-term randomized control trials that are on a pilot phase. So we don't have sufficient information about follow-up time and whether these effects are sustained over the long run, and also whether there are unintended consequences and adverse effects that the interventions that we are looking at might cause in the long term. And so we encourage researchers and funders to really do these long-term follow-ups and look at unintended consequences. Next slide. issue of external validity is very important. A lot of studies occur in a particular context, and we already talked about the importance of social norms, of context, of as modulating the impact of various interventions and various relationships. And so the idea of trying to replicate studies in different institutional and societal contexts and cultural settings is really quite important, and basically try to establish the external validity of some of the conclusions that we came up with in the report. Next slide. Yeah. Now, a lot of the studies tend to look at a particular intervention that has a specific, like a cash transfer or a youth development program or a microcredit program. And we feel that, especially in the context of women's empowerment, there is potential for interactions between different interventions that could significantly change the effects and maybe create more powerful effects. So integrated approaches that look at a combination of, for example, cash transfers and an intervention to address restrictive social and gender norms, or sexual and reproductive health with psychological care needs. This combination of interventions needs to be looked at more as an integrated form that could have synergistic effects on the different components. Next slide. And finally, we've thought that there weren't enough studies that went from the pilot stage to the scale-up stage and really showed how cost effective the interventions are, and the issues of kind of the implementation science. How do you implement something at a much larger scale while maintaining its effectiveness? And so we felt that there was a need for much more systematic tracking of program implementation and scaling and evaluations of scale-ups once a particular intervention is shown to be effective at a pilot stage. Next. Finally, the final set of recommendations is about collaboration and harmonization, and the committee felt that there was a need for greater multidisciplinary coordination, with a specific multidisciplinary group to be established to help coordinating, especially the various measures, and to set standards that then can be applied in different contexts. So this committee would be representative of both researchers and practitioners, and it would allow for these various measures to be established and validated with psychometric assessments and other ways of validation, so that they can be applied on a large scale in different study contexts. Next slide. Yeah, and the same committee, we feel, kind of would help in setting priorities for government programs and research data collections to be coordinated and aligned, and in fact, to be able to try and get at a little bit more consistency across measures of agency and empowerment, so that we come up with more consistent results on the relationships that we seek. Okay, next. Yeah, and I think that's it as far as now. Notice that we didn't make any policy recommendations. The National Academies is really try and the recommendations we were told that they needed to affect the knowledge creation process, while we have a lot of implications for policy, which we'll talk about later in the question and answer session. We didn't feel that it was a position, or the National Academies didn't feel that we were in a position to tell governments what to do, but to really provide the evidence and let them come to their own decisions. So that's why the recommendations are much more directed towards the knowledge creation process, and rather than policy recommendations.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Yount, Dr. Assaad. I want to remind the audience that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I will weave them into our moderated discussion that we will begin now. I wanted to begin by asking a bit about the process. What happens, what's the backstory to this report? I spoke a little bit about how it's experts in their field that are nominated or to be part or invited to be part of the committee that puts together a report like this. It goes through rigorous review. But what are the standards for producing a report like this? And how did you, as a committee, a large committee that Kathryn outlined, how did you ensure that you could meet those standards? Tell us a little bit about the making of the report.
Maybe I'll tackle this question first. So the very important emphasis on the word consensus report. And it's key that this diverse committee and fairly large committee, very interdisciplinary, coming from very different backgrounds, reaches consensus on what the messages and the findings of the report are. And so that takes, basically subgroups of the committee or individuals may draft certain sections of the report based on evidence, and clearly the findings have to be backed up in evidence and published evidence at that. But then there is a series of meetings in which we really try to reach consensus on these findings and on the general messaging. And that's a process that takes time and takes a lot of effort on the parts of the committee to basically listen to different disciplinary voices, to try and speak in ways that other disciplines can understand, and people from various various identities and backgrounds. So I think the main issue is that it's an evidence-based report trying to come up with a general consensus of the knowledge in this area, but which also has this multidisciplinary, multi-background consensus reached on the contents of the report. But as far as, there weren't too many other kind of dictates coming from the national academies about what can and cannot be included in the report. We were told that we shouldn't be making recommendations to governments and but directing our recommendation to the scientific community and to the knowledge creation process.
All right, thank you. I don't know if Dr. Yount, if you had any follow-ups. If not, I've got a question for you.
Sure. Just the only thing I would emphasize, Christina, is the importance that the committee placed on diversity of discipline. Diversity of discipline is represented in the report. What we learned through the process also is that research on women's empowerment, its relationships with other constructs, often occurs in disciplinary silos. And so one of the efforts of this interdisciplinary committee was to bring that literature together. Hopefully that was successful. And where the committee felt that we needed additional intellectual or disciplinary diversity, people were invited in to share their comments for consideration in the report. So strong attention to diversity intellectually, disciplinarily, and representationally.
Great. I would like to back up a bit and ask, why women's empowerment? Why does this concept matter? Why was it something that became the topic of a National Academies report? Why do we need better frameworks for studying it? And how is this framework that you've detailed so beautifully, how is this better than previous frameworks?
Christina, thank you so much for that question. I'll take a first response to that and invite Dr. Assaad to complement. The committee talked in detail about why women's empowerment matters. The literature talks in detail about that as well. The framework essentially is an instrumental framework, right? In the sense that women's empowerment is conceptualized as influencing the dynamics of population and in turn socioeconomic development. And the instrumental utility of women's empowerment is often a focus of discussion and debate. The committee also wanted to underscore, and it does so with consensus at the beginning of the report and then in an entire chapter, that women's empowerment matters in and of itself. And so we devote an entire chapter on the relationship between investments or levers for change in multi-level, in a multi-level conceptualization of enabling resources, and the full range of dimensions of women's agency, from their own critical consciousness, a measure of intrinsic agency. Those concepts we debated vigorously in the committee, to their ability to interact and influence decisions with others, to raise their voice in the context of often gender normative constraints, their ability to convene and to form collectives, and the nature of the dynamics of those collectives. And then importantly, a gap we found in the literature, and emphasize that in the report, is the role of women's social movements and how they have historically influenced policy in ways where we can improve our understanding of that. So understanding women's empowerment as an important concept in and of itself, and an important lever and concept in which donors and governments can invest to affect change in both population dynamics and socioeconomic development, as an important sort of cyclical process, if you will, to reach more equitable conditions and greater equity in terms of reaching human potential. The framework itself, I think, is a major contribution, hopefully, that will guide research going forward, because it delineates not just the complexity of these relationships, but does so in a tractable way. So it provides very clear definitions of the multi-level nature of women's agency. It delineates the multi-level nature of resources for investment, and then key dimensions of socioeconomic development that align with the SDGs, key dimensions of population dynamics, and so really provides a guidepost for a plethora of research going forward that can look at these different levels of these different concepts in a very tractable way. So hopefully it is a tool to guide research going forward.
Okay, and I think that seems to answer one of the questions we have from our audience members, who said that they found it hard to understand what parts of the framework were very different from other frameworks being used. But so it sounds like perhaps it's that multi-level concepts that you have in the framework, and the clarity of the pieces of the framework in comparison to previous frameworks.
Absolutely. So the goal was the goal was actually to build from existing frameworks in a way that offered a recognition of the complexity of these concepts, but to make it tractable by delineating the various levels of those concepts, offering definitions that could be used in a standard way going forward to develop measures that don't exist, to operationalize these multidimensional concepts more clearly.
And I did want to circle back to your comment about it being an instrumental framework, yet having portions. So it's instrumental, and the framework itself, looking at the graphic, women are in the middle as a sort of a mechanism leading to population outcomes or socioeconomic development outcomes. But then you did try to place emphasis on women's agency in and of itself as important, not only as a mechanism leading to these other outcomes. Were there explicit discussions as a group about instrumentalization and whether or not the framework should be instrumental in its approach? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, and I'll invite Ragui to ensure interdisciplinary consensus and that we're reflective of the group's discussions. The reality is that the charge of the committee was to develop a framework that delineated the relationships between women's empowerment, population dynamics, as a potential pathway to socioeconomic development. So that was a key component of the charge of the committee. And so the entire report is organized around that charge, chapter by chapter. The committee did want to recognize that these concepts have bidirectional relationships, and the committee did want to recognize the mechanism by which resource investments would influence pop dynamics and socioeconomic development, with an emphasis on agency. The emphasis on agency was identified because it's been identified in the literature as a critical component of empowerment that's central to this framework. It's also emphasized because of identified gaps in conceptualization and measurement. And third, it's identified because it is a part of the framework itself. And so understanding more clearly the relationship between investments or levers for change, investments in enabling resources for women, influences agency is a critical part of the framework and is a critical pathway in and of itself. And I'll emphasize that that chapter focused on levers for change and agency also identified some important gaps in the literature. So I invite people to review that chapter carefully.
So maybe I can build on the previous question a bit by shifting to a question for Ragui, especially given your past engagement with population issues. I noted in the beginning of the report that this report was to be a follow-up on a 1986 National Academies report that was titled Population Growth and Economic Development Policy Questions. And I noticed the date, right, 1986, which is on the heels of the Cairo conference, the 1984 International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. And at that conference, there was a really important shift internationally. Prior to 1984, there was really a consensus internationally about population control. And it was at that Cairo conference, really a watershed moment in which feminists in particular were able to ally with the population establishment, things like the UN Population Fund, USAID, and that were very much population control oriented, and shift the focus towards women's empowerment rather than population control. So here you are, many decades after 1984, and we still have women's empowerment. We kind of have both pieces in your title. We've got the women's empowerment piece that to me reflects that post-84 consensus, but you're building on a report that's really coming out of the population. It still seems to have more of the population control aspect to it. And so it almost seems like you're trying to bridge these two discourses. And I wonder, how did you navigate that tension between these discourses? And they haven't gone away. Some of my work has been on the sterilization of Indigenous women in Peru in the 90s, right? So that control discourse is still with us as much as we've seen some change at the same time. So tell us a little bit about how you navigated that tension.
Yeah, I mean, one has to realize that. So this ad hoc committee was called to come together by what is a permanent committee of the National Academies, which is called the Population Committee. And so the focus on population and population dynamics is not at all incidental in this report. It's very at the core of it. And so part of our charge was to really think about how do you think about population dynamics in the context of this changing consensus at the international level about the way kind of the population debate has been going, from this top-down population control kind of ethos to one in which it's about women's reproductive rights, it's about women's reproductive decision-making and control, and it's about having autonomy in your decisions about your reproduction. And so I think that the as the consensus shifted, the National Academies realized that this 1986 report was kind of outdated in its approach and its the way it was looking at population and development debate from a very macro perspective, and that there was a need to really reflect that change in the international consensus that is focusing much more on a kind of autonomy in decision making, ability to make decisions about your own reproduction, and so in fact, the sponsor of the report, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is very much active in the population field, in family planning, in providing population programs, and wanted to really see that their work as being kind of informed by this new consensus about the importance of women's empowerment in that nexus. And so I also want to point out on the instrumentalization question, the way that socioeconomic development is conceived in this report is very much about equitable socioeconomic development, and in particular, gender equitable socioeconomic development, so that gender equity into the way that socioeconomic development is conceptualized. And so we look at, clearly the effects of various kinds of programs. But when we, these programs and levers of change have direct effects on population and on socioeconomic development, but we emphasize very much kind of their effect that goes through women's agency and women's decision making, and so that the lens of women's empowerment becomes a very important part. And if you're interested in women's empowerment in and of itself, then there's this big discussion about how do these interventions, these levers of change, these social and institutional and legal changes are affecting that outcome in a direct way. So I would say that the population ethos is very much built into this report, and there's a lot of people with demographic backgrounds who have been active in the population associations, etc., and research, but it clearly, this reflects the very major change that happens in the way we speak about population issues, from this kind of control and utilitarian sort of thing to try and promote development through population control, to one in which it's about autonomous decision making about people's reproduction and reproductive rights. So we do acknowledge, though, that there is this debate on population control and measures of family planning, etc., that come from that older way. In fact, we commissioned a background paper for a historian to write about the change in this debate over time, and it's an appendix to the report. So that that history of the way that the population discussion has been going can be reflected.
Interesting. I'm going to ask one more follow-up population question, and then I want to move to, we've got a number of interesting questions in the Q&A. But since we're on population, you mentioned a couple of times in the report the fact that, in contrast to the 1980s, now increasingly countries are worried about population decline rather than overpopulation, and the implications of population decline for socioeconomic outcomes. I'm wondering, is there more to say that maybe did not make it into the report about population decline? I mean, it's just a few lines, really, but what does this imply for women's empowerment and population dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could have spent more time talking about population decline. It was brought up in a number of times by committee members, but the focus of the report being on low and middle income countries, in which that problem seems a little bit further away than it is in some of the advanced countries that are experiencing population decline right now. And so there was a feeling that this was an issue that needed to be thought about and dealt with, but it's not something that was going to be a major focus of this report at the moment. And clearly it has many implications on the care burden, for example, that mostly borne by women of an aging population. And so kind of that shift and without the appropriate institutions for care, then it could actually create an important new burden for women on the aging population. And so I do agree it is an aspect that was not developed fully in the report, but it was something that was brought up in the discussions, and maybe potentially it could be the subject of a future report, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a good segue to one of the questions from our audience of who asks, how do you choose the geographic areas for study? You shared that the study focused on low and middle income countries, the global south. Why not the global north? So many studies have focused on the global south and give a perception that we always need to unpack the other and not connecting women's empowerment on a global level.
Yeah.
Kathryn, do you want to tackle that one, or I could?
Sure. I want to just take a quick step back, Christina, if I may, and then we can address the viewer's comment. A couple of important points to raise with respect to aging populations and population decline. And I think we may get to this a little bit in more detail later. But the age range that was the focus of this report were girls and women 15 to 49. That's a very standard age range in the field of demography. It's the age range for many population-based surveys. It's the age range for which the bulk of the data, a lot of the data are available. But in some respects, that was the charge of the committee. In other respects, that's where the data are most available. And so just wanted to acknowledge and it's acknowledged in the report that we don't focus directly on older populations of women, while we recognize that that's an important group for consideration. But there are elements of the report that allude indirectly to some of those concerns or questions, and that's all of the data that's summarized and empirical evidence for the relationship between aspects of women's resources and agency and age at marriage and various aspects of reproduction, fertility, birth spacing, et cetera. That all has implications for the population dynamics that you pointed out. With respect to the geographic areas, the charge of the committee was to focus on low and middle income countries. There is some mention of data from higher income countries in passing in the report, but that is not the focus of empirical attention. That's in part the charge of the committee. In terms of the geographic distribution of evidence, there is a recognition that some of the more rigorous evidence comes from specific geographic areas, for example, areas in South Asia. Evidence from China also is emphasized. So the geographic distribution is in part influenced by the sources of evidence, the types of evidence that are emphasized in the report, as well as the charge of the committee. And I don't know, Ragui, if you'd like to elaborate on that with respect to geographic distribution.
Yeah, I think in terms of the focus on the global south, the low middle income countries, that really came with the charge. And it's partly also because there is the demographic community is kind of quite divided in terms of the people who study the global south versus the global north. And there was a kind of a choice on the part of the sponsoring organization as well as the national academies to focus on the global south. But in terms of within that, which areas of the world got more emphasis was really driven about the sort of literature that was available, which is often driven by the kind of data that's available. And so in this field, the demographic and health surveys are a huge source of data. And so a lot of people tend to do research based on those survey data, and many of them are focused on Africa. But they tend to be more cross-sectional in nature and don't allow for the kind of study designs that allow for causal inference. And so South Asia has been, India in particular, has been a very big focus of studies that try to leverage institutional change, legal change, and look at the impacts of those on various outcomes. But it's really driven by the literature we could find. And we made an effort to really dig up all the literature possible. And for example, Latin America is not very strongly represented in that literature for some reason.
All right. We just have about 8 minutes remaining and several important questions. I want to ask one question, if you could answer it briefly, and then we're going to move on to an audience member question about policy implications. But before we move to that, I wanted to know, what about men in this report? A lot of focus on women's empowerment, absolutely, huge literature on this, important, yet gender-based violence is usually perpetrated by men on women. There's something to, there's something to be done in this equation for men. And I was struck in your vast literature review about the lack of research really on men's roles in women's empowerment. Should we be placing greater emphasis on that in future research? And if so, what should it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the recommendations of the report is that there should be more focus on men and particularly structural sexism and aspects like that. But there are some small studies that focus on young men, for example, and trying to change gender norms among young men. There are studies that have couple dynamics and looking at interventions that involve both men and women. But they're not the norm. They are few and far between. And so definitely one of our recommendations is that there needs to be more focus on men and changing male behavior and looking at structural sexism as a very important part of the issues. So I do agree that women's empowerment is a key critical part, but men play an important role in determining how women's empowerment can actually affect these outcomes that we're interested in.
Yeah, and I'm sorry,
ahead.
just really briefly, Christina, I'll refer people to the report. There are studies that are summarized in various chapters, so I just encourage people to read, where we look at proxies for women's empowerment, specifically age difference, educational differences, occupational differences, asset distributional differences between men and women in the household, and couple dynamics. And we do refer to studies that look at implications of those proxies for agency on experiences of intimate partner violence. There also are intervention studies that have components where men are engaged. But at the same time, it's not something that's systematically done. The findings tend to be mixed. And so I would just encourage the readers who are interested in what's summarized with respect to men's engagement in the report to review the various empirical chapters.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time yet where we want to plunge into the policy implications question. One of our audience members says, I shared this report with my colleagues and friends in the nonprofit sector in India. They appreciated the content given how approachable and pragmatic it is. Congratulations. I am curious to know what some of the policy recommendations the authors have to suggest to both nonprofit organizations and government bodies in the Global South, keeping in mind that they implement a variety of women's empowerment programs at the grassroots. So yeah, so tell us a bit about what are some of the, I know you explicitly said in the presentation that you were encouraged to aim your recommendations to the research community. At the same time, you reviewed an enormous amount of literature that evaluates policy. And so what can you say about policy implications?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so there is a huge amount of research on kind of impact evaluation of policies and programs and interventions. So, for instance, I'll divide those into multiple areas. In the economic intervention areas, there is a lot of research on cash transfers, for example, and there's a very important consensus that has developed in the cash transfer literature that directing, and it's in fact now practiced across the board, that directing cash transfers towards women has much more beneficial effects on their families and their households because of the way the women make decisions about expenditure are different from the way men make decisions about expenditure. And there's a whole even transformation in the literature on the economics of the household that has occurred, moving away from these models that think of the household as a unitary decision maker to models that think of households as being sites of bargaining between men and women with differential power. And so that consensus is now considered part of the policy landscape. Now, there's also evidence on microfinance programs, on women's employment and job training programs, on so all of these and the evidence is often mixed, but sometimes there's clear evidence about things that work and work well, and they're reported on in the report. The second area of policy, or at least intervention, is women's collectives, and there's a lot of work on self-help groups and to the extent to which self-help groups add to, for example, in agricultural development, women's co-ops, or in microfinance, having groups of women work together as opposed to individual women. And there's quite a bit of policy results about kind of how bringing women together in collectives can advance empowerment and collective empowerment. There is a tremendous amount on women's health initiatives, and in particular on sexual and reproductive health, but also maternal and child health. There is some evidence on youth development interventions, and some of those interventions are with young women to kind of increase their awareness and their self-efficacy and their ability to act upon, make decisions and act upon them. So directly kind of empowerment sort of interventions, but also combined with interventions such as entrepreneurship training or job training. And sometimes when they come in combination with these economic interventions, they work better. But some of these youth development interventions are for young men, and to try and work on gender norms on the part of young men, and some of them are couples based. Now, on the area of social and legal protections, there is quite a large literature evaluating important changes in laws that have occurred, for instance, changing inheritance laws to allow women or to basically give women inheritance rights, and kind of the effects of that down the line on women's education, women's employment, and so, for example, the literature used to say that if you add more income to the household through, let's say, an inheritance, women work less because of the income effect. But in fact, it's the opposite. When women have inheritance rights, they are more likely to enter the labor force and work because they're able to make a decision about their employment, and so that's an important effect. There are also literature on gender quotas in politics, and the kind of reservations of certain political seats for women, and a big literature on the impact of that on the aspiration of girls, and the girls taking these women as role models, and making and changing their decisions about education, but also about the decisions that political leaders make that are different from what male political leaders would make. So the reservations. There is work on subsidized childcare and its effects on women's ability to participate in the labor force and in productive employment. So I think there is a long list of programs, policies, interventions, all the way from the micro to the social and legal changes that is documented in the report, and I think can serve as a guide for people who are interested in the effects of these programs.
Thank you. I mean, I know that when I read the report, it's quite comprehensive on each of these policy areas, and there's also some contradictions in there that I read because there's a lot of variation depending upon context, depending upon the specific way in which a program might be implemented. As we start to wrap up, I want to throw one more question at you from an audience member, and then we will close the webinar. So very briefly, what is the most surprising thing your group learned during this process? I thought that's a great question.
What is the most surprising thing?
I think we had a lot of surprises. It's hard to think of the most surprising. I think one of the things that I would emphasize, Christina, is there are large literatures in many disciplines, and those disciplines have not necessarily historically spoken to each other. And so I think the committee felt a strong need to make sure that there was healthy, ongoing cross-fertilization between political science, sociology, demography, economics, psychology, and public health, so that we could really develop a more comprehensive understanding of these relationships. So bringing those literatures together was, and I think that happened, the differences also happened in the dialogues across discipline as well. So making sure that we were judicious in representing the contributions of all disciplines was really important to us.
I mean, to me, the most surprising was the importance of certain key data sources for a very large bulk of the research. So the demographic health survey, for example, is a really important data source for looking at some of these issues. And the way the questions in that survey operationalize women's empowerment and women's agency becomes extremely influential, because everybody is then constrained to use this particular way of thinking about operationalizing and measuring some of these concepts. And so investing in improving the measurements in some of these cross-national data sources is really quite an important investment.
All right, and with that, I want to thank everyone who has joined us today for joining this discussion and presentation of the latest National Academies report. This has been a fascinating discussion. I encourage people to access the full report online. We will have a recording of this webinar that you will be able to access on our YouTube channel in the coming week. Thanks so much for being with us. And thank you in particular to Dr. Yount and Dr. Assaad for joining us today.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Christina.
Thanks to everyone.